Good afternoon and welcome to CogX. We're here at the Economy and Future of Work stage, and coming up is an absolutely stellar lineup coordinated by the Institute for the Future of Work. And what they'll be talking about is thinking about not only the future of work, but also the future of well-being as we move towards a digital economy, trying to ensure that we have an inclusive and equality-driven economy that works for everybody. The event has been brought together by the Institute for the Future of Work, and I recommend going onto their website and signing up for their weekly newsletter which covers all sorts of things about the future of work and the impact on society and inclusive growth. Also, if you want to tweet any of the event, please do so at CogX 2020 or @_future of work. I'm now going to hand over to the director of the Institute, Anna Thomas, to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Nash. I'm really excited and feel hugely privileged to be moderating this expert panel on a topic that to our front-running speakers has always been incredibly important. And now, as we emerge from COVID, they have our attention too. We're all waking up to the fact that it's the future of work and well-being together that is perhaps the most significant determinant of whether we get the next 10 years right. So COVID is the biggest health crisis in the UK for a century, and it's completely upturned our world of work too. It's exposed divisions and inequalities in both work and health that can be hidden, at least from the mainstream, and it's revealed the strength of the connections between them too. We've seen that those most likely to be exposed to COVID are those most likely to suffer more serious health impacts. And also those less likely to have the protection of secure and good quality work. So against that background, I'm going to introduce my amazing panelists, asking them to focus on three main areas. Firstly, what have we learnt about work and well-being in COVID-19? Secondly, what's new and what's just been revealed to a wider audience? And thirdly, what can we do about it? Each of the panelists are going to present for about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to have a discussion. There'll be live tweeting as we go from _future of work. And you may ask questions on the Slido too. If we don't get to them, we can move them to the discussion afterwards. So my first speaker is Tom Watson, who really needs no introduction. He's the former deputy leader of the Labour Party. He's the former chair and founder of the Future of Work Commission, and he's also a best-selling author of Downsizing, in case anyone hasn't got it yet. So he can talk to us about this topic, perhaps telling us about his personal journey too, from Westminster to the woodlands of Kidderminster. Tom, the floor is yours.
Anna, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for promoting my book. And if you don't mind me saying, you've got a very impressive bookshelf sitting behind you. And it's a genuine delight to be on this panel, bringing together the notion of work and well-being is an obsession of mine, and it is a genuine honour to be sharing this panel with two experts, with Michael and Jennifer. I feel quite inadequate, particularly when you compare my book Downsizing, which is essentially an eating memoir on a journey, a personal health journey, when you compare it to Michael's masterpiece, The Health Gap, which is a genuinely majestic piece of work, and we should all be grateful to him for giving us that book. What are we learning from COVID-19? I'm going to start from a slightly unusual place. I don't think it's a particular coincidence that the discussions we're having around the world on Black Lives Matter after the tragic murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we're thrown into turmoil by that. And it doesn't surprise me that it's happened during this pandemic. Because even though there's no biological reason identified at the moment for the pandemic to discriminate, we know that it does. It discriminates in countries which have systemic issues caused by racial inequality and where health and economic disparities are exaggerated, such as our country and the US. People living in more deprived areas of the UK are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The risk of death from it is higher among people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And people across the UK have shown their solidarity and thankfulness for the work of our frontline roles, firstly to acknowledge the risks that our staff in the NHS and the caring professions are taking, but also others working on the front line. Previously unsung, unidentified, unclassified key workers, such as street cleaners, refuse collectors, supermarket workers, and delivery drivers. And when you look at the analysis from The Guardian, that 60% of deaths amongst health workers are people from Black, Asian, and other minority ethnic backgrounds, we know that the burden of COVID-19 is not being borne equally. There's an estimated 10.6 million people in the key worker occupation. And these are people whose daily work ensures that their fellow citizens are kept safe and well. And almost 1.6 million key workers in the UK are considered to be at greater risk of COVID due to an underlying health condition. Pre-COVID, employment levels across the UK, across the country, have been steadily increasing, but it's come at the price of growth in unstable and low-paid work and practices such as zero-hour contracts. COVID has revealed quite how vulnerable some workers are, just as it's revealed the fragility of our just-in-time economy. So bad work can affect health in a number of ways. We know that. Low-paid work keeps people in poverty, which has a long-term impact on not just their mental and physical health, but also the health of their children. We've got over 1.5 million working people in poverty in the UK today, and we know that that's only likely to go up in the months and years ahead. Bad work with long hours and low autonomy is also a significant source of stress for people across the income spectrum, but particularly for those at the bottom, for whom work-related stress interacts with the stress of living on low wages. And stress and other lifestyle factors are linked to deprivation, such as poor diet, lack of exercise, and they're closely linked to the number of life-limiting and threatening diseases, not least cardiovascular disease, strokes, cancers, diabetes, and other conditions like that. The poll conducted by Opinion for the Institute for the Future of Work that coincided with this festival showed us the extent of social and economic insecurity and the future fears for those in low income and insecure jobs. So what we're seeing is that the health and work inequalities are compounding. I think if we want to create a strong and dynamic economy, we have to address these systematic and underlying inequalities and create the conditions of work which will build resilience and allow people to flourish. We can do that by concentrating on good jobs, better work and well-being. But there is now an opportunity to do this better in the future. This is why I'm so delighted that Anna's commission was brought back together by the Institute for the Future of Work nearly 3 years after it originally reported. And I understand it's expected to report shortly, and I await its recommendations with keen interest. The ultimate purpose of work must be to support good health and well-being and to enable individuals to flourish. I think this should be the central purpose of the economy. There's things we can do now. The approach is ambitious, but it involves a big shift in thinking. It's not something we can do overnight, but there are things we can do now. New risk means that as a society, we need to revalue caring work in tangible ways, starting with the living wage. COVID shows particular proximity to work and health, as the challenges such as sick pay demand a coordinated cross-departmental approach to maximise the chances of a swift recovery. Unions and businesses must work with government. We're seeing that in the education sector when that goes wrong, to develop a strategy to address the root causes of the inequalities that are hitting us now as a key part of shaping the UK's future of work. And in my view, a commission or a council dedicated to the future of work would support the government and its partners develop a recovery plan. A key part of this would be, let's call it Work 5.0, the UK's improved and updated version of Germany's Work 4.0. And I'm proud of my former commission is leading the way with the call for its action, and I support it, and I hope all the political parties, including the Labour Party, can too. And health and well-being should be elevated to be the primary goal for our economy. COVID has brought home the truth that measurements of health and well-being, not GDP, are the gauges that determine our success. We probably need to improve some statutory protections for key workers. Personally, I like Elizabeth Warren's idea of a key rights for key workers. And to do this, to create a healthy and happy, productive workforce, the government, I think, should maintain its leadership role it's taken on with the furloughing scheme to support nationwide training for our workers. For example, we could have a baby furlough scheme in which the government guaranteed up to 20% of wages for training purposes, as IFOW's chair and Nobilist Crispa Serrades has said. I think it's a good idea. Going further, the government will need to create new jobs and do so fast. The Prime Minister is a former mayor and the Chancellor an entrepreneur. In a sense, they're uniquely placed to support the entrepreneurial state and the entrepreneurial local authority too. These are worrying but exciting times, and there's a huge opportunity to act, to give us a wider understanding of the inequalities of work and health and build back better. The poll published by IFOW this week has shown a clear link between job security, income and resilience. To ensure we have a strong and dynamic recovery, we need to make sure that we can build it on a strong and resilient workforce. This means a healthy, happy workforce and an acknowledgement that the people of this country are our country's greatest asset.
Thank you, Tom, for your brilliant presentation, for your support and all your ideas. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and we should be circling back to those at the end of the presentations. Can I now move on to Dr. Jennifer Dixon, who's CEO of the Health Foundation. She's got a list. Her CV is too long to read out when we've only got 5 minutes. But among other things, she's been Chief Executive at the Nuffield Trust, Director of Policy at the King's Fund, and has been Policy Advisor to the Chief Executive of the NHS too. She also initiated and ran the Marmot Review 10 Years On, which was published in February 2020, and we strongly recommend that anyone that hasn't read that does so now. Jennifer, can I hand over to you, please?
Oh, thank you so much, Anna, and very nice to hear Tom's comments. Just for anyone who doesn't know us, just one sentence: we're an independent foundation, so we're non-partisan and we don't take income. So hopefully we can be as evidence-based and as objective as possible. So just a couple of points, I think, really echoing and probably hopefully building on some of the things that Tom said. We know in this country that there are massive differentials in mortality rates and life expectancy in the population, massive health gaps. And I know that Michael is probably the world expert on this, and he will talk about those in a minute. And that those in the UK have been widening. The gap between rich and poor in particular on life expectancy has been growing, particularly in the last 10 years. And what COVID, I think, has done is that it's really thrown this into sharp relief. It's not necessarily added anything new, except it's exacerbated what we already know, in part because of the exposure to the virus, and in part because of people's vulnerability to the virus. So we see differences, as Tom says, between people in different occupational groups, people in different socioeconomic groups, people according to different comorbidities and illnesses that they have, which make them vulnerable to, as we know, to COVID, age group, obviously, ethnic groups, very, very critical and important. And also regional differences as well that we see. So COVID has really sort of thrown all this into sharp relief along some of those lines, and the intersection between those aren't neat categories as we know. They are complex and intertwined, and they are synergizing in some populations to make the risk much, much higher than it should be. So I think that's what COVID has done. And as Tom also says, that we do know that work itself and lack of work indeed have an enormous impact on our health. And the kinds of dimensions that are important with respect to employment include the following. They include autonomy, how much autonomy you have at work, how much well-being you feel, your pay, how satisfied you are with work, and of course, job security. And we know that there are significant issues in the labour market with a lot of jobs that score very low on all of those, and that this is leading to huge vulnerability to shocks, sudden shocks like COVID, but slower burn shocks to health insulting environments like obesogenic environments and other things. We also know that there is a dual labour market. We also know that over half of the people stuck in jobs that score low on some of those factors, over half of them are stuck in the same job 6 years later. So we know these are issues. And I think the added spice to this, which probably doesn't relate so much to COVID, but I think I want to say, is that young people are often stuck in these particular jobs. It's their first job out of college or out of school. And our special inquiry that we had on the future well-being of young people showed that younger people felt, not only were they insecure and felt that their job was fragmented, but they also felt once they were in a job, no one kind of looked after them, no one showed them the ropes, no one helped be a kind of mentor or could help them think about the next stage, someone who knew the ropes. So they were doubly more likely to stick in these jobs, particularly when they didn't have much social capital amongst their family or background. So another reason not to flourish. So those are some of the factors that clearly we need to involve. Now, also what many others have said is that the quality of work is so integrally related, not just to short-term economic cycles, but longer-term structural effects in the economy that we all know about, that have been written about, particularly in the US, with Hillbilly Elegy and Janesville, and Case and Dayton's work more recently, Deaths of Despair, the decline of big industry, wage stagnation, dual labour markets, as I've said. So I think what's happening is that COVID is just shining a light on all of that, which is affecting, and the new urgency is not just because of the disease load, it's also because clearly the insult to the economy is forcing people to think. The George Floyd effect is having a complete impact there. And also the public response to key workers has been quite overwhelming, I think. So I think those three factors are now coming together to add spice and urgency to what then could need to be done. And I think there are a couple more things to say. The first area where I think people, I see from polls and from what I've been reading and hearing, is that people are wanting much more protection at work, social protection from the state in a number of ways to do with welfare. That seems to come across. Another is a hunger for more preparation and planning for the future. And as somebody put it, instead of having a just-in-time economy, to have a just-in-case economy where we can plan and have reserve capacity for all sorts of things, not just sudden insults like coronavirus, but longer-term issues such as climate change, as well as a hunger for more inclusive growth and growth that doesn't depend just on GDP growth, as many have pointed out. So I think those are some things. So final point from me is, so what do we do about it? Well, clearly, there are a number of agents here who can help to pull this issue together. The obvious one is government, both in fiscal policy. There's also the Bank of England and investors with monetary policy as well. That should be played into this. And there's quite a long agenda about what government could do and to help here. But bottom of this is to have some kind of comprehensive strategy for growth, where government has a role in reshaping the economy. In terms of the world of work, it's to do with pay, it's to do with skills, social protection, diversity, quality of jobs, union power, worker engagement, supporting national key industries if we want to decide to have more national industries as opposed to just-in-time international supply chains, and all that means for management. This is too big a job for government, especially a government that is reeling from the effects of the immediate insult of COVID, and also a government that is trying to deal with Brexit as well. So I think there's a big role for civic society, for others to help with this cross-government activity that's needed. And as I say, the central banks, I think, also have a role, be it Bank of England in particular, but also those organisations that influence central banks as well. So there's a very long agenda, and clearly we've got to start somewhere, and it shouldn't all just be government, business, or local government. I think there's a wider role for civil society, of which the Future of Work Institute is a shining example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for the super presentation. I can see some common themes emerging, but I'm going to move straight on to Professor Sir Michael Marmot. Sir Marmot was formerly the past president of the World Medical Association. He's led research groups on health inequalities and been a thought leader in this space for over 40 years. He's been chair of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which was set up by the World Health Organization. And he's also done a landmark review on the request of the British government, published and called Fair Society, Healthy Lives in February 2010, before doing the update that I mentioned earlier with Jennifer, called the Marmot Review 10 Years On. Can I introduce, please, Sir Michael Marmot?
Thank you. As we think about building back better, I want to highlight 4 issues: inequalities, the quality of work, unemployment, and the climate crisis. All of what we do and what we think about has to be in the context of green issues. As you've heard from Tom and Jennifer, inequalities have been increasing, and particularly inequalities in health have been increasing, both by levels of deprivation and regional inequalities. And relevant to the Institute for the Future of Work, work plays a key role in that. Again, I'm building on what both Tom and Jennifer has said. If you think about what work provides: personal development, self-esteem, opportunities for learning and flourishing. Second, social status. What do you do? Oh, I'm an X, I'm a Y. It's very often said in relation to work. The third, money. And fourth, social relationships, something that we're all having to learn to deal with in isolation. In my 10 Years On review, published in February this year, we showed that there were problems in all 4 of those areas, that the nature of work has changed, so that particularly with the growth of the gig economy, 0 hours contract, the kind of opportunities for development from work that people expect have been somewhat limited. And that relates to work providing social status. And thirdly, in-work poverty has gone up over the last 10 years. Work was supposed to be the way out of poverty, and it isn't. The majority of people below the minimum income threshold are in a household where at least one member is working. They're in a working household. People are poor not because they're feckless or lazy or shirkers. They're poor because they're lowly paid. And fourthly, social relationships. What we find is the lower the social status, the less people report they have a wide array of social networks. Now, all of those have been put under threat by COVID-19. And what we're seeing with the huge growth of inequality, that people in higher status occupations are able to work from home, and people in lower status occupations either lose their jobs or are in frontline occupations. So it's all very well to say, if you can work from home, do, and if you can't, go out and expose yourself to the virus. That's good for the rest of us, for you to be exposed. That doesn't sit very well, does it? And given that we've now recognized how important key workers are to all of us, can we now pay attention to the latest figures I saw, that the ratio of the earning of CEOs in the FT 100 to the national living wage was over 105, that ratio, and to low-paid workers who are not getting the living wage is more like 200, 300. So we're recognizing that these key workers are vital to the whole economy moving, but we don't pay them. Look at the crisis in care homes. In my 10-year on report, we pointed out that the reduction in spend on the adult component of social care was 3% reduction in the least deprived 20% of local authorities and 16% reduction in the most deprived 20%. Care workers are paid miserably, poor job protection, not well trained. We've been arguing that people who work with early childhood should have master's degrees. They should be properly trained. So should people be properly trained and properly paid who work with older people in care homes. A part of a civilized society is we respect people at every stage of the life course. So the fact that we came into this pandemic ill-prepared is no accident. It's what's building on what's been going wrong over the last decade. So how do we get out of it? Well, three things have happened with COVID-19. The first is we're no longer hearing that the British public are tired of experts. That may have been a useful soundbite. Now we're hearing we're following the science. That may or may not be true, that the politicians are following the science, but at least they're acknowledging the importance of the science. That's good. The second is that government was always seen as the enemy. Small government is good. In something I wrote recently, I commented that Ronald Reagan's phrase that the most frightening 9 words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," are not being quoted at the moment. We recognize government has a vital role to play. Why do we not have personal protective equipment? Because government didn't make the arrangements to get PPE to frontline workers in the NHS and in care homes. Government has a vital role to play. And the third thing that's come out was we were presented in 2010 with the idea that there was something morally deficient about government debt and deficit. We were the false analogy between a household budget and a government budget was made reprehensibly. I don't know if people believed it, but it was quite false in economic terms. And suddenly we've had a government say more or less we support universal basic income. That's what the furlough scheme is, a version of UBI. We'll spend whatever it takes. My goodness, this is really different. So as we emerge from COVID-19, the number one is we must, under no circumstances, go back to the status quo ante. What we had before COVID-19 crashed upon us was not good. nowhere near as good as it should be. That's what my 2020 report said. We don't want to go back to that. And we don't want to go back to the orthodoxies of growth of GDP, shrinking government debt is the major role of government. As Tom said, the major role of government should help the population achieve health and well-being. That's what we want as a society. And that's what we should all be working towards. So an Institute for the Future of Work says, how can we build a fairer, greener economy that promotes human flourishing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was fantastic. And is everyone coming back now to the screen? We've covered such a lot, and there are so many different threads there, that I feel we should pick up, Michael, where you left off and start talking about that big umbrella question, which is the purpose of the economy, the direction of the economy. Does it mean that what we've seen, that we should reorient the economy? And how do we begin to do that? How can we start that process?
Well, if you're asking me, I've been saying for some time that health and the fair distribution of health tells us a great deal about how well the society is doing. So close is the link between social conditions and health that if the society is improving, health will be improving and health inequalities will be diminishing. The fact that health stopped improving and health inequalities got bigger over the last decade tells us that things were going wrong. They were going badly. When I was commissioned to do my 2010 review, I was commissioned in 2008, it was because the government of the day in 2008 said, health inequalities are too big under our watch, and we're not happy with it. We want to make them smaller. So the government of the day was saying, we know under our watch health inequalities have got too big and we want to do something about it. And so I would say if the purpose of government is not to grow the GDP, if the purpose of government is not to shrink the debt and the deficit, but if the purpose of government is to attend to see how can we bring government, civil society, the population together to deal with the social conditions that lead to better health and a fairer distribution of health, then we will have a better society.
Does anyone else want to come in, Jennifer?
Yeah, just to say, even if you were just really hard-nosed about the role of government and just said, okay, the purpose of government is indeed to maximize economic growth, just say that was your aim, which it isn't ours. You know, are you going to achieve that with an unhealthy population? So even if you were just considering GDP growth, you need to have a healthy and skillful workforce that is able to cope with future challenges and not least technological change. So even on that basis, having an unhealthy society doesn't stack up. The second issue is that, as others have said, and other countries have tried this, is that to widen your measures of success. And many have talked about this. There are lots of examples. New Zealand is the favourite one that everyone discusses, that you measure the success of a government or indeed society through looking at how we've affected natural change on natural capital, social capital, human capital, financial and physical capital. That's how New Zealand sort of look at it. And I suppose the third big question for me is, you know, what will make them do it? If we're so used to, you know, chronic short-termism. I think it was Al Gore who said the future, the present shouts, but the future whispers. You know, how do you get people to really focus on the future? And then that means a reorientation to a different value and perhaps thinking about the tools that would make government focus on the future and not discount it to the extent that they do. Now, that's a long story and there is lots to say about that. But for me, those are three sort of responses to your question.
That's fantastic. So measurements, focus on the future and values. It does perhaps lead to a next question, which is how do we build a sort of a a health promoting focus across government, given many of the things that you've all talked about and identified are not always directly in the control of the Department of Health? How do we start doing that?
Well, my number one recommendation in the 2020 report, the Marmot Review 10 years on, was that the Prime Minister should chair a cross-government committee to elaborate a strategy for reducing health inequalities, because departments that relate to early child development, to education, to the environment, to housing, the Treasury, are all vital in this. And as you say, when ministers, secretaries of state for health acknowledge the importance of this, but in the end, their budget relates to the healthcare system, and that's where their focus is. So my number one recommendation was it should come from the Prime Minister and be a cross-government action.
I mean, how difficult is cross-government activity is the question. I mean, it is an agenda that requires cross-departmental action. Must be written into the code of civil servants that they are meant to be working across government and collaborating. So how difficult can this be? But I guess I come back. One of the reasons why I think it is so difficult is because people are dealing with the short-term things in front of them, and there isn't the headspace, the reserve capacity to even think or imagine the future, which is, I think, an issue, which is symbolized by our response to COVID. As many have said, we have not had the imagination, the foresight, the cross-departmental thinking, cross-disciplinary thinking to imagine the future, because we haven't had the space, because we've been stumbling from thing to thing. So I think this requires a real look at how, not just how we could do things better, but how other countries think about short-term insights like COVID and longer-term challenges of the type we're facing, whether it's technological, climate change, whether it's I don't know, information, pollution, whatever it is we want to talk about. But how difficult should this be, really? It's about thinking space capacity and bringing in a wide variety of people and voices. So it's diverse thinking across business, across sectors. Tom may have some better insights as to why it's so difficult in the government. But
well, thanks for blowing me in. I mean, your point on focusing on the future, Anna. I would say we all should focus on the future, but understand the past. And actually, it's 100 years ago that in the mining sector, 60 miners a day lost their life while going to work. And it was only because the state willed it that they were no longer going to die, that we were going to give them better terms and conditions, that we were going to talk to organised labour, that we were going to give them proper health and safety, engineering standards that were unique and the like, that we started to bring that death rate down. To build on what Michael said about social care, if the state wills it, if the state decides, the elected government that decides it wants to enhance the conditions of social care workers who look after our vulnerable and our old folk, to pay them a decent living wage, to give them a career path, to give them the respect and dignity that the work they do deserves, then we can will it. But it does require political leadership. And I think where we're at with COVID now, I mean, all orthodoxies are have been blown out of the water by this. I mean, the idea that a Boris Johnson-led government could be paying the wages of nearly half the workers in the private sector was an unheard of notion 3 months ago. It could well be taking an equity stake in some of the most important industrial sectors in the country by the time we get to a next general election, because it's the government of last resort. And that means it can take some big decisions on public health as well. I mean, in my real world, I think about, I want to live. I'm 51. I decided I wanted to live a full and fulfilling life for another 51 years. I want to live to be 102. Right? I'm mildly obsessed with longevity. And so if you look at it, what are the 80% of us die of cardiovascular disease, cancer, or Alzheimer's. And globally, the pharmaceutical industry spends about $1 trillion a year on R&D to try and allow us to live a little bit longer with those conditions. When every epidemiologist will tell you the reasons, what brings supercentenarians together is the fact that they get these diseases, but they get them much later than the rest of us because they live healthy lives, right? So what I'm really saying is, if Boris Johnson wants to lead a national crusade to totally reform what we do in public health, to put well-being at the heart of the workplace, to think about a national sleep strategy for all those night shift workers that have been sleep deprived and having their insulin resistance go up and their blood pressure go up because their sleep patterns are disrupted, and all the things we know that can improve our health, then it can be done there. I don't think there's any sort of ideological baggage that people are carrying. We can do it, but it requires political leadership.
Mm-hmm. So if I can flip that round, what does work look like if securing health and flourishing is its purpose?
Well, there's been quite a lot of research on psychosocial characteristics of work. We've already heard about stress at work going up. We know, I mean, the two most prevalent models are the demand control support model. In other words, high demand, low control, and low support at work. Increases risk of cardiovascular disease, of mental illness, and sickness absence. And that's not something that individuals can change. You can't say, right, I'm taking more control of my workplace. That's related to the structure of work. The second model that's been much used is effort-reward imbalance, high effort, low reward. And that's not just money, but it's some of the other things that I talked about, personal flourishing, self-esteem, social status, reward. So high effort, low reward. And again, that's related to the structure of work. And then we've added to that in our own research, looking at perceived injustice at work. And that, on top of the other two, also increases risk. Now, they're all things that can be changed. Not everybody needs to have a university degree from a top university to have fulfilling work. We can change the way work is organized so people feel they do have some control over their lives, commensurate with the demand put upon them. They do get rewards commensurate with the effort they put in, and they do perceive that their workplace is characterized by fairness and justice. And all of that would lead to human flourishing, quite apart from paying people enough.
I think just one thing is that for me, the coronavirus epidemic has really shown the public value of protection, somehow, security and protection, whatever it takes. And that's why I think the NHS offer is so very powerful. If you think about that security and protection at work, it has been eroded, hasn't it, over time? People, job insecurity is massive. How do you build a life, a family, a future if you are insecure, particularly if you have low pay? How marriageable? How can you build an existence? So I think there's some very basic things, in addition to the things that Michael says, that really need to be put in place about pay and longevity of security.
Yeah, that takes me perhaps to one of the questions that's come up on the Slido, which is how does what you've all described translate into protecting and looking after the huge numbers of workers who are going to be unemployed and then in transition? Does anyone want to have a go at that before we wind up? Or we could leave it for our discussion. It is a big one.
Well, there's kind of what organizations can do themselves, employers, but then there's also the characteristics of the economy in which they are operating. And there again, I come back, this is probably too big an issue to raise like 1 minute before, but you know, the role of central banks to try to not just focus on price control, but also to inflation, but also to think about employment and levels of employment as being an objective of theirs. So anyway, we've probably run out of time, but there's quite a lot of stuff that employers can do to increase security at work and hang on to staff as opposed to jettison them at for expediency reasons. Sorry, we're just out of time, so maybe we can say more in the Q&A.
Yeah, exactly. I think we'll have to pick that up in the Q&A. Thank you very much all for a fantastic panel. I think the big themes that come out of that are the purpose of work and of the economy. There seems to be a huge measure of consensus that really that's about health and flourishing. Second, focus on the future. That's future work and future good health. And thirdly, that a cross-disciplinary, cross-department, integrated approach to this is the way forward. Thank you all very much, and to CogX for having us.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, and to all the panelists for a really fascinating discussion about the importance of good work for the future of health and to ensure that we have health equity going into the future. We already have a lot of questions coming in, and as you can see by the panel slightly running over, there is a lot still to say. So hopefully see everybody in 15 minutes for the Q&A after the session. Thank you very much again to the panelists, and goodbye from us.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.